everyone. My name is Dr. Erika Sigurdson, and this is Making History. Today, in honor of the back-to-school season, we're talking about university life in medieval Europe. We're going to learn about the life of the mind, the dedicated youngsters toiling away, developing their minds and honing their skills for a lifetime of service to king and church. But also, we're going to be talking about when and how you need to treat your examiners to the services of a prostitute in medieval Vienna. So it's September, and the leaves are just starting to turn. My kids went back to school this week, and there's just that glorious autumn feeling of back to school. New beginnings, new school year. I love it. So to kick off the back to school season, I thought today we'd take a look at university life. I thought I'd have a go at that most classic of YouTube video formats. I've never done this before, so bear with me, but I'm going to do a listicle. I might hate it, I don't know, but it's good to try new things. But that being said, to pull it back into my nerdy comfort zone, I have settled on 7 things. 7 facts about university life for the 7 liberal arts, which structured university learning and are the reason I, for one, have a bachelor's of arts. Universities are medieval institutions. So universities are a creation of the Middle Ages. Of course, there have been schools and, congregations of teachers and students in all kinds of different formats throughout history and in a variety of cultures and parts of the world. But it is remarkable and to me fascinating the extent to which our modern university experience was invented in the 13th century. From rectors and provosts and chancellors to the faculty of arts and the Bachelor of Arts that so many of us are working towards or have achieved at some point. There's no clear beginning or founding date for the earliest university because they were a new thing. They grew gradually out of these loose associations or trade guilds of teachers and students. But we can say that this was taking place in the late 12th and early 13th century. The earliest university statutes, so rules governing the operation, were for the University of Paris, and they were from 1215. We also know that the 2 oldest universities were Paris and the University of Bologna. Oxford and Salerno were a couple other early universities with no clear founding date. And these early universities gradually coalesced rather than being deliberately founded like later universities would be. But the model spread really quickly, and we can more clearly identify the foundation of the next gen: Cambridge in England, Montpellier and Orleans in France, and a number of examples from Italy and Spain, including Naples, Salamanca, Padua, and some others, all in the first few decades of the 13th century. So something was happening, something was changing, and we're going to explore what that was. But first, what even was a university? So to be a university, or what was more commonly known at the time as a studium generale, you needed 3 main things. The first was that they accepted students generally, meaning both local and, international students. So that's the meaning of that term, studium generale, as opposed to other schools that only accepted local students. The second element of university was they had to teach the arts, as we've seen, and at least one of the higher faculties, which at that time meant medicine, law, or theology. And you needed to be a master of arts before you could begin a course of study in those higher faculties. And the third thing that separated universities from other centers of learning is that students were taught the arts by a master of arts. So the innovation of the universities was really in many ways about credentialing. To be a master's, you had to meet certain criteria and also passed a standardized examination, usually after a minimum of 6 years as a student. So all of which brings us to fact number 2. Students were under the supervision of a master. This fact was not true at all universities. Actually, specifically, this was not true at the University of Bologna, where the student organizations held a lot of power, and actually the students hired their own masters and held the master accountable for delivering a certain standard of education. These rules were actually so strict that masters at Bologna weren't allowed to leave the city, even for short trips, without getting permission from the students. And they could be fined by the student body for things like skipping a lecture or not starting and ending class on time. Or even, and this is real, if a master failed to attract enough students to his lecture, if 4 students or fewer showed up, the master would be fined as if he had skipped the lecture himself, which I just think is great. But Bologna was primarily a law school, so it's possible, for one thing, that this worked because the students on average were older and more able to manage themselves. It was also true that Bologna, one of the oldest universities, just kind of developed organically out of its specific circumstances without the benefit of working off of prior examples. So what we see is that as more universities were founded in the 13th and 14th centuries, most followed the model from the University of Paris, not the Bologna model. The Paris model was not student-centered. Instead, the masters were in charge, and every student at the university had to put themselves under the supervision of a master. In the 13th century, it was actually even common for a lot of universities for students to live in lodgings with their master. Can you imagine? That only changed actually because eventually there were just too many students and it wasn't practical. There were a couple reasons. The first was this more kind of high-minded, idealistic idea that moral character was an important prerequisite for learning, right? To be receptive to learning, receptive to knowledge, the students needed that moral foundation, which, in my more idealistic moments, I kind of agree with. The other reason universities wanted the masters to control student behavior was more of a power thing. So as universities coalesced into these actual institutions, more formal than just these loose guilds of teachers, they pushed really hard for independent governments. They especially were fighting against town officials who were trying to enforce the law on the scholars of the university. There were a number of incidents throughout the 13th century. Things like students smashing up drinking establishments or sexually assaulting a townswoman or getting into destructive brawls and bar fights. And to protect their authority and their autonomy, universities worked really hard to reframe these behaviors as disciplinary issues, not crimes. So universities produced statutes regulating student behavior and tasked the masters with enforcing that behavior. But we'll see as we go through how well that worked out in practice. Universities offered vocational training. So we kind of come back to this question from earlier. What was the point even of these early universities and why did they grow and develop? So one major reason was that university education was actually a much needed vocational training. So starting in the 12th century, one of the broad social changes that was happening throughout medieval Europe was the development of these more complex administrative structures of bureaucracy. So this is where I have to be careful because I could talk about ecclesiastical bureaucracy forever. It's my passion, but it's such an inconvenient passion because I know that nobody cares. It's objectively boring. And I want to elaborate just a little bit on what I mean by that. So it's starting in this time period that say you wanted to petition the Pope for a divorce. Well, unless you're a very powerful monarch, you're not going to see the actual Pope, right? He's busy. In earlier periods, you might go to your bishop or just agree to kind of go your separate ways and not worry about the paperwork. But starting with smaller changes from the 12th and 13th centuries, increasingly, you could petition not the Pope, but the papacy for your divorce. So instead of the Pope having to make an individual decision about every single Christian's marital problems or legal cases, some bureaucrat in an office somewhere. This is why I'm fascinated by this, because it seems very normal and natural to us now, right? I have no expectation that Justin Trudeau is personally handling my passport application, but it wasn't always that way. Anyway, I could keep talking about this for a while, but I feel like I'm veering a little bit off topic. Basically, if the Pope's not personally deciding if you can get divorced, he needs to hire people to do that. He needs office work, and the universities were training them. The skills that were needed to fill these new bureaucratic jobs were things like reading and writing, Latin, because that was the language of these bureaucracies, numeracy, and especially things like bookkeeping and accounting, an understanding of the law, and an understanding of government. And harder to pin down, but they also needed a foundation of a shared way of thinking, a way of organizing facts and organizing ideas, of explaining your thinking and defending your decisions. So universities taught these skills, these clerical skills, and they trained people for these clerical bureaucratic vocations. There might be other reasons to attend university. Increasingly a university education became necessary for men who were aspiring to positions of power within the church, not just these bureaucratic jobs, things like bishops and cardinals and popes. But they also needed the skills and the discipline taught at those universities. An interesting consequence of what I've been describing is what it means in terms of who is attending university. Firstly, and I've been maybe alluding to this a little bit, but it's good to be explicit, university was only for men, right? Boys and men, because these administrative roles were predominantly located within the church, and the church even today has its views on gender roles. Secondly, the men who attended university actually tended to come from quite an interesting middling background. So obviously university education was expensive, which would exclude boys from the poorest backgrounds. But it also wasn't, at least initially, all that appealing to the sons of the highest nobility. And it wasn't at all designed for lay people, men outside of the church. That would come later. Absolutely, universities did turn into these finishing schools for aristocratic boys, but that was into the early modern period and later. But in the 13th century, most students were either the sons of the lesser nobility or a kind of well-off merchant and artisan class growing up in towns and cities. University education created opportunities for advancement for these intellectually minded, ambitious boys from outside of these hereditary power structures, which is interesting, I think, and can help us understand some things about student life. There was hazing. So nowadays we have this pretty standard trajectory into higher education, right? High school to university and so on. But in the Middle Ages, the pathway through university was a lot less standardized. In fact, the majority of students weren't even there to get a degree. More than half of all university students in the 13th century attended for less than 2 years, some even drastically less, and never sat any exams or qualified for any degree. While there was a lot of this variation in the typical student or typical learning path, many boys started university between the ages of 14 and 16 years old, like Thomas Aquinas, the famous philosopher, who was 14 or possibly 15 when he started studying the arts at the University of Naples. Part of the reason for this is that the prerequisites for university were actually fairly basic. Students needed a grounding in reading, writing, and the liturgy, but mainly they needed to know Latin because that was the language of instruction. And even then, students would leave university with a lot more Latin than they came in with. They were expected not only to learn and memorize text in Latin, which we'll get to, but also to communicate with their masters and fellow students in that language. And there are actually these phrase books from 15th century Germany to help students with their Latin in everyday situations. And you'll be pleased to learn 2 things about freshers arriving at medieval university. Firstly, medieval freshmen absolutely did undergo a variety of hazing. A lot of the specifics are a little unclear from the source material. We can know some details. So one university, for instance, had rules against the older students throwing things out the windows at the new students coming in. So we can guess that that was maybe part of the hazing freshmen. One hazing tradition that is well documented is that new students were expected to treat the older students to like a big expensive meal and night out drinking. The university is often worried about this and would try to rein it in. One university, Orléans, got really worried about what this was doing to their freshmen, saying that they were being treated like sheep to the slaughter and dragged into drunkenness, housebreak, and other offenses too serious to mention. But I think we all know the students kept doing it anyway. The second thing that I think you would be pleased to know about medieval freshmen is that they weren't called freshmen, actually. They were called, or rather, in the singular, one fresher was called a beanus. I just think that's funny. Now, I could be wrong, but my Latin tells me that the plural of beanus is beanie, which means that a group of freshmen was a group of beanie. Isn't that funny? I mean, that is objectively funny. Beanie? I don't know, actually. I'm going with beanie. Okay. Studying meant memorizing. In some ways, university classes wouldn't have looked that different today. Students attended lectures, or in their words, they heard lectures. That word is actually important to notice because the word lecture, coming from lectio, means to read out loud to someone. And that is the basis of what lectures were. The masters would read out the main text with commentary and with explanations in between, and they would leave room for questions if students didn't fully understand something. If you missed a lecture or needed a refresher, the bachelors, who were students working towards qualifying as a master, might provide supplementary rereadings. But generally, the master was likely the only person in the room with a written copy of the book he was reading and commenting on in the class. So listening was very important. Learning meant listening and memorizing. Now, masters, of course, didn't simply read out a complex text without explanation or instruction. In fact, the explanations soon became codified and written down themselves in what were called glosses. And I just want to highlight this for a second because this style of teaching created a really interesting style of writing or of formatting books. So I want to show you a couple examples. The book started to be written with these glosses, these annotations written in. And some of them don't look at all that different from if you're just highlighting or writing notes into your textbooks. So for instance, you can see here, it kind of looks a little bit like a later user just writing notes in the margins. Though it could be misleading. It could be that the marginal writing was original. But then you come to the main teaching texts, and especially the more complex ones for the higher faculties. And I want to use law here because I think in many ways is the best example. So the main legal text for canon law was called Gratian's Decretal, but it was really 2 texts in one. You had the main body of the text, which was a concordance of legal precedent, but alongside it, you had the commentary law. And the gloss was the context or the standard interpretations of the text and all that extra information that masters had to teach and the students had to learn. And the decretals do not look like someone just scribbling in notes in the margin. They look like this. See how it's organized on the page? You have that main text laid out in the middle. And all that text around the outside, that's the gloss. That's the commentary. In many books, the gloss is much bigger than the actual text. And that's a really important part of doing history. We can connect this everyday experience of a 13th century university student with the writing on the page of this manuscript that we can still see and look at today. Neat, right? Okay, and one final fun fact about those lectures. Undergraduate lectures started very early. The University of Paris statutes specified that all lectures in the Faculty of Arts should be finished by 9 a.m. And that was done so the masters could also attend lectures in the higher discipline, so theology, law, or medicine. So classes ran often between 6 and 9. So there was definitely, totally, for realsies, no alcohol and no sex. 13th century university students had the status of cleric. So time for a technical aside. You'll sometimes hear me use the words cleric and priest interchangeably. It's convenient, but they're actually not the same. A A priest is one of the clerical orders, but there were lots of other ones. And especially students who came in when they were 14 or 15, that's too young to be a priest. So they were in what was called the minor orders, kind of like, I don't know, cadets is to the army. So the thing is, being a cleric gave boys and men certain privileges, but also specified moral requirements, namely celibacy. So clerics in the minor orders could actually marry, unlike priests. They were still supposed to maintain like sexual purity before marriage, like everybody really, but more so. But while technically clerics, these students were also a big old group of 14-year-old boys living together with very little adult supervision. So I want to share what I think is a very funny detail about college life in England specifically. So this was in the 14th century, at something that happened at 3 Oxford colleges and 1 Cambridge. And this may have applied to others, but that's where we have the evidence. So these 4 colleges were especially paranoid about their students being exposed to sexual temptation. And so they committed to only hiring male servants within the college. But the one job they could not hire men for was laundry. There just weren't enough, if any, male laundresses. It was a female-dominated profession. So these 4 colleges had to employ female laundresses. But to mitigate the danger there, scary, they had 2 layers of rules. So rule 1 was that the scholars were not permitted to directly hand their laundry to the laundress. They had to give it to a college servant who would then pass it along to the laundress through the college gate. So she wasn't allowed in, they weren't allowed out to deliver it, which is in itself ridiculous. But it's made so much better by Rule 2. Rule 2 restricted the kind of woman who was allowed to do the college laundry. Can you guess what Rule 2 was? So Rule 2 specified that laundresses for the college had to be old and ugly. Or, of such an age and appearance that no sexual misdemeanor was likely to arise. So that's in the words of historian Alan Cobban, who strikes me as the kind of eminent scholar who would feel uncomfortable calling someone old and ugly. Either way, the English colleges worked hard to protect their students from accidentally having sex with an ugly old laundress. But that was the old fogies, right? The academics and the institution, the dean. But what about the students? So students were interested in slightly different things. One of the things they were interested in was heavy drinking. A common penalty for breaking college rules was that the student had to buy wine for all the masters of the college. A common complaint from townspeople was that drunken students were tearing around town, getting into fights and destroying property and various other things. And a slightly weird thing that they seem to have done fairly frequently was to get drunk and break into people's houses. So one of the formal organizations that developed early at the university were something called Nation. They were kind of like a student group, almost like an early kind of fraternity, loosely based on the nation of origin of the student. They started at the University of Paris, which had 4 nations: the French, the Normans, the Picards, and the English Germans. They used to fight a lot, quite literally. They would brawl and students would end up in jail or dead sometimes. Not super frequently, but often enough. And you'll be shocked to know that a lot of that violence was fueled by alcohol. So we know from their records actually that the English-German nation, for one, spent a substantial portion of its budget on wine. And it's actually possible for historians to build up quite a robust map of all the taverns and drinking establishments that were in existence in the 13th century on the left bank, the University Park, Paris, by going through the meeting records of the different nations. That's how often they mention a specific tavern. Another interest for university students, who were again, remember, all men, mostly teenagers, was prostitution. So in Paris, lectures were held on what was called the Street of Straw. In 1358, the street had to be closed off at night because the prostitutes would do their business in the lecture halls. Back at Oxford, a 1443 inquiry into prostitution found, among other things, that the scholars were not only using those services, but at least 4 of them were found guilty of procurement and promotion of prostitution. Okay, and last example, but at the universities of Heidelberg and Vienna, because they were worried about bachelors spending too much money on their celebration, so that's their celebration for becoming a new bachelor, the universities legislated that they could only invite their examiners and not all their friends to the bathhouse after passing their exam, which might not mean anything, but it also might mean that bachelors at these universities were expected to treat their examiners to the services of a prostitute after passing their exams. And maybe their friends too. Maybe they never followed that rule. But the important thing was that they were never tempted into sin by ugly old laundry women. They could get away with murder. In 1209, 2 Oxford scholars were convicted of the murder of a local woman and hanged by the town authority. Now, this was a little unusual. Like I said in the last section, scholars were clerics and should have been prosecuted through the ecclesiastical courts, which might still have resulted in a punishment, but a much less severe one than hanging. That didn't happen in this case only because of some larger political conflicts that were going on. This is actually relevant to the founding of Cambridge University, because the whole Oxford community went on strike in protest, not of the murder, but of the punishment. And so one group of scholars were so incensed at, being subject to local laws that they picked up and moved their teaching somewhere else, which happened to Cambridge. But in Oxford, the situation resolved a couple years later when a papal legate, which is a representative of the Pope, determined that the town of Oxford had been in the wrong to prosecute and hang these two scholars for a murder that they probably did. And so the town had to pay retribution to the university and make new statutes that protected the university and its scholars from, the horror of being held responsible for their own actions. So increasingly, with the powers of popes and kings behind them, remembering that universities were training up the bureaucrats that these people needed, universities gave themselves the power to sanction and discipline their own students. And they protected their students, and especially their teachers, from being subject to local authority. So I've enjoyed this romp through university life in 13th century Europe. Obviously, it's fun to hear about the hijinks and the drunken student stories. Not unlike today, remember that a lot of these students, after university, would go on to what was essentially the medieval equivalent of a white-collar job. They weren't the elite aristocracy, they weren't lords or major landowners. They might end up in positions of authority within the church, but many of them were destined to these boring office jobs, processing dispensations in the Vatican, or maintaining taxation records for the royal chancellery. So university for these men was a pathway into that bureaucratic class. Probably for lots of them, the primary value of their time at university was not so much the lectures and the curriculum. They probably got as much from the drinking and the brawling and the hijinks, because that's where you make your friends and build networks, right? Who knows? Maybe the guy you woke up in jail next to that one time after that epic night out, maybe he's the one who knows someone who's going to get you your first job. And I imagine that for a lot of these men, after many years of maturity and working their safe, boring office jobs, I can see them trading in stories and anecdotes, talking about the craziest night out, right? That time they got drunk and punched an innkeeper in the face, and you wouldn't believe what happened next. Again, it creates those bonds. It creates that shared experience. But the knowledge of that creates such a fascinating tension for the university administrators and the masters and the powers that be, right? On the one hand, we've seen how they had this very strong need to uphold their legitimacy and their independence, which they were doing by projecting this image of the university and its scholars as these sober, moral men of the church, men of learning. It's why they wear the robes. It's why they fought so hard to keep their scholars from being accountable, even for murder. But they also knew about this other hidden curriculum, the socialization of boys into scholars or clerks. And they tried to regulate and control it, but only ever to a point. Anyway, thanks for listening. I know this is kind of a long one. There's a lot to say about it, and I've really enjoyed working on this topic. So we've now officially moved to a 2-week schedule. So we'll be posting every second Thursday. So check back in 2 weeks. And until then, stay curious and do good history. Bye-bye.